Hi, I'm Donna Kelce, Taylor Swift's mother-in-law. Yesterday morning at 6:30, my son moved out. I was standing in the kitchen with a cup of tea I did not want, and I watched through a window while he put 4 bags in a car, and his wife stood in the doorway and lifted a hand. She had packed 2 of the bags herself, at a table, on Tuesday night, off a list she wrote. And she had put something in one of them that she did not tell him about, which he found at 9 o'clock last night in an empty house in Kansas City, and which made a 36-year-old man sit on the end of a bed for 10 minutes. He will not tell me what it was. Now, I know what a title like this does, and I know some of you are already frightened, so I am going to end that in one sentence. Nothing is wrong. Nobody is leaving anybody. There is no crisis, and there is no trouble, and this is not that video, and it is never going to be that video. And if that is what you came for, I would like you to go somewhere else. He has gone to Kansas City for the football season, which he has done every August since 2013. But he has never done it as somebody's husband before. And there was a word in an article yesterday that 3 people in this family noticed, and none of us told each other about, and I have not been able to put it down for 30 hours. There is a story that went up yesterday afternoon. You have probably seen it, or seen it repeated, because it has been repeated about 400 times in a day. It says that Taylor and Travis are settling into their new normal. It says a source told Page 6 that they are finding a new rhythm as a married couple and really enjoying what that feels like. And it says one other thing, in the middle of a sentence, that nobody has stopped on. It says, they were pretty much inseparable. Were. That is the past tense. Somebody wrote a paragraph about how happy 2 people are, in a story about them enjoying their new life, and put the best thing about their old one in the past tense, and about 400 outlets copied it, and not one person on this earth has stopped on the word. I stopped on it at approximately 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon, and I have not really moved since. I watched what that actually looks like yesterday morning, and it is not what the article says, and I want to tell you the difference. Because there are 3 things in this, and they are all one thing. The first is a word in the past tense that nobody noticed. The second is a thing my son said out loud for the first time in July that cost him something to say, and a thing his wife does with the same word that I have watched her do about 9 times and have never mentioned to anybody. And the third is what the old normal actually was, which almost nobody understands, and which I did not understand myself until I stood in a doorway yesterday morning at 6:30. Somebody put the word inseparable in the past tense yesterday. They were right, and they did not know why. Let me tell you what actually ended. Part 0.5, the Tuesday before. I want to give you Tuesday night, because I keep telling people what the last 3 years were, and Tuesday night is the actual answer. It was about 9 o'clock. Kitchen. 4 of us, the 2 of them, me, and a person who works for her who I have written about elsewhere, and who has been in that woman's life since 2008. And somebody said something about the schedule. And I watched the conversation, and I have not been able to stop thinking about it since. Here is what happened. The 4 of us worked out loud, at a table, the next 4 months of 2 people's lives. Not romantically. Logistically, there were 2 calendars open and a piece of paper. And about 11 minutes in, I understood that I was watching something that had never happened before, because for 3 years, that conversation did not exist. I have talked about this, and I am going to say it more precisely now. For 3 years, every single time Travis Kelce and Taylor Swift were in the same room, one of them had looked at a schedule and moved something and got on a plane. There was no joint calendar. There was no arrangement. There was no version of that Tuesday night conversation, because there was nothing to plan. There were only individual decisions, made weekly, about 150 times. And on Tuesday night, There were two calendars on a table and a piece of paper. I said something about it. I could not help it. I said, "You've never done this before, have you?" And they both looked up. And Taylor said, "Done what?" And I said, "This." Sat down and done the 4 months. And there was a pause. And my son said, "No." And she said, "No." And they said it at the same time, and then looked at each other. And Travis Kelce said, "Huh." And she said, "That's true, actually. We've always just done it week by week." And he said, "Because we had to." And she said, "Because we had to." And then she said, "And now we don't." I want you to hear what happened in that kitchen at about 9:10 on Tuesday night, because it was not sad, and it was not a crisis, and I have thought about it for 2 days. Two people found out, in front of me, that they had stopped having to. And nobody said anything about it. The conversation carried on. Somebody said something about a Thursday, but I watched my son go slightly quiet for about 40 seconds and then come back, and I have known him for 36 years, and I know exactly what 40 seconds of quiet means. Part 1, 6:30. I was there. I want to say that at the top because it matters, and because I do not usually get to. I have made a great many of these videos this summer, and a large amount of it has been telephone calls and things I found out afterward. I was in the room yesterday morning. I had gone down on Tuesday because there was a thing on Wednesday, and because I am 73 and I go when I am asked. And on Wednesday evening it became apparent that he was leaving in the morning, and I said I would get up, and Travis said, "Do not get up," and I said, "I am getting up." So at about 6:20 yesterday morning, I was standing in a kitchen with a cup of tea I did not want. Here is what it looked like. It looked like nothing. I want to describe that properly, because I had come downstairs braced for something, and there was nothing there. Two people, both dressed, both awake for about an hour. A cup of coffee each. A conversation about a route. He was going through a bag on a counter looking for something and could not find it, and she found it in about 4 seconds in a different bag, which is a thing that happens in every house in America at 6:30 in the morning. Nobody was sad. I want to be honest about that because I am not going to manufacture something. They were, if anything, slightly brisk. There was a schedule. There is always a schedule now. And at about 25 past, he picked up 2 bags and she picked up 2 bags, and they took them out to the car together, which took about 90 seconds, and I stood in the kitchen because I did not want to be in the driveway. And through the window I watched my son put 4 bags in a car and then stand up and look at his wife. And they did not do anything. That is the part I have not been able to leave alone. They did not do anything. There was no scene. He said something, and she said something back, and he got in the car. And she stood in the doorway, and he backed out, and she lifted a hand, and he lifted a hand, and then he was gone. I have watched people leave for 38 years. I have watched 2 boys leave for college, and for camps, and for seasons, and for surgeries. I have never seen anything as efficient as that in my life. Part 2. The word. She came back inside and picked up her coffee. And I said, "Because I could not help it, are you all right?" And Taylor Swift said, "Yes." And I said, "Really?" And she said, "Donna, he's 400 miles away and I'll see him in 11 days. I said, "That's not what I asked." And she put the coffee down. And she said, "I read the thing yesterday." And I said, "Which thing?" And she said, "The new normal thing." And I said, "I read it too." And she said, "Did you get to inseparable?" I want you to understand what happened to my face in that kitchen. I had been sitting on that word for about 14 hours. I had not said it to anybody. I had not said it to Ed, and I had specifically decided not to say it to her, because it is the sort of thing that a mother-in-law should not put into a young woman's head at 6:30 in the morning after her husband has driven away. and she said it first. I said, "You noticed." And Taylor Swift said, "It's in the past tense." She said, "Somebody wrote a nice story about us and put the best thing about the last 3 years in the past tense, and I do not think they noticed doing it." She said, and about 400 people copied it. I said, "It's just a word." And she said, "Donna." And I said, "I know." She said, "It's not just a word, it's the correct word." Part 3. What she said next. She said, "We were inseparable." She said, "It is true, it is exactly true, and it was the best year of my life." She said, "From about last September to the 3rd of July, we were essentially never apart for more than about 11 days, and mostly not for more than 4. She said, "And there was a reason, which is that we were planning a wedding, and a wedding is a project, and a project makes you inseparable in a way that is very easy to mistake for something else." I said, "Mistake it for what?" And Taylor Swift said, "For being the way we are." She said, "We were not like that in 2024. We were not like that in the first half of 2023. We were two people with two extremely large jobs who saw each other when we could." She said, "And then there was a year where we had a reason to be in the same building constantly, and it was wonderful. And it is over. And the reason it is over is that we got what we were planning." She said, "The article is right. That is the part nobody's going to like." She said, "We were inseparable. Past tense. That is accurate and it is not sad and it is what happens." And then she said the thing that I sat down for. She said, "The difficult part is that nobody tells you the good year is a project." She said, "Everybody says the first year of marriage is the hard one." She said, "It is not. The hard one is the one after the year when you had a reason." Part 4. What the old normal actually was. Now I have to tell you about the 3 years before, because I do not think anybody understands what the arrangement actually was, and I did not either until about 11 o'clock yesterday morning. Everybody thinks the story of those two people is that they saw each other a lot. That is not the story. Here is the story. For 3 years, every single time Travis Kelce was in the same room as that woman, it was because he had chosen it that week. I want you to sit with that. There was no arrangement. There was no house they both lived in. There was no default. Every single occasion, for about 1,000 days, was somebody looking at a schedule and deciding to move something. I have watched him do it. I have been on the telephone with him while he did it. I have listened to that man work out loud, that if he did a thing on a Tuesday instead of a Wednesday, and flew at 11 at night instead of the morning, he could have 19 hours somewhere. And then do it. 200 times. I have not counted, and I am not going to pretend I have. But it was not a handful of grand gestures. It was a constant, low, unglamorous, week-by-week rearranging of a man's entire professional life around getting into the same room as somebody. For 3 years. And here is the thing I did not understand until yesterday. That is not what married people do. Married people do not choose. Married people have an arrangement. You live somewhere. There is a default. The default is that you are both in the house at the end of the day, unless something specific happens. Nobody rearranges anything, because there is nothing to rearrange, because the arrangement is the arrangement. I said this to Ed on the telephone last night, and I said it badly, and it took me 3 goes. And when I finally got it out, my husband said, "Yeah." And I said, "Yeah, what?" And Ed Kelce said, "That's the trade." He said, "You go from choosing to having." He said, "And having is better." I want to be clear that having is better, and anybody who tells you otherwise has not had it. Then he said, "But nobody tells you what you're giving up, which is that somebody had to pick you on a Tuesday." Part 5. What she said about it. I said this to her yesterday. Not as well as Ed said it, because Ed said it in about 9 seconds and it took me 4 minutes. I said, "For 3 years he chose you every week." And she said, "I know." And I said, "And now there's a schedule." And Taylor Swift was quiet for a moment. And then she said, "I have thought about this more than almost anything else this year." She said, "Everybody thinks the romantic part is that he came." She said, "The romantic part is that it was optional." She said, "He could have not, every single time. There was no arrangement, and no obligation, and no house. If he had not turned up in October of 2024, nothing would have happened. Nobody would have said anything." She said, "He turned up because he decided to, that week." And then she said, "And I do not have that anymore." I said, "Taylor." And she said, "No, listen, because this is the part I have got right, and it took me until about June." She said, "I do not have that anymore, and I have got something better, and I would not go back." She said, "But it is a loss, and I am allowed to say that it is a loss." She said, "For 3 years I was chosen every week by somebody who did not have to." She said, "Now I am married to him, which is the thing I wanted more than anything, and it means he does not have to choose me anymore. He just has me." And then she said, "That is what inseparable being in the past tense actually is." She said, "It is not that we see each other less." She said, "It is that nobody has to decide anything anymore." Part 6. What he said on the telephone. He called me at about 11, from the road. He said, "Did you get up?" And I said, "Obviously I got up." And he said, "I told you not to get up." And I said, "I have been getting up since 1987, Travis." And then he said, "Was it all right?" And I said, "Was what all right?" And my son said, "This morning, was she all right after?" I want to tell you what I did, which was that I lied slightly. I said, "She was fine." And he said, "Mom." And I said, "She was fine." We talked about the article, and he said, "The inseparable thing?" I put my hand on the counter. I said, "You noticed it too?" And Travis Kelce said, "It's the past tense, Mom." Three people. 3 people out of what must be several million who read that paragraph yesterday, and all 3 of us are in this family, and none of us had said it to each other. I said, "Have you talked to her about it?" And he said, "No." And I said, "Why not?" And my son said, "Because I read it at about 9 last night, and I was leaving at 5:30, and there is no version of bringing that up at 9 o'clock the night before you leave." He said, "What would I have said?" He said, "Hey, so this article about how happy we are has got a word in it that means something's over." He said, "At 9 o'clock, the night before." And I said, "So what did you do?" And Travis said, "I went and found her and asked if she wanted a cup of tea." Part 6.5. The 2 bags. I want to go back to the packing, because I have skipped over it, and it is the thing in the title, and it is not what anybody thinks. She packed 2 of the 4 bags. I want to say what that actually was, because Taylor Swift packed his bags is a sentence that sounds like devotion, and it was not devotion. It was considerably better than devotion. He packs badly. I want that on the record. My son is 36 years old, and he packs the way he has packed since he was about 15, which is at speed, 40 minutes before he leaves, by putting things in a bag until the bag is full. He has done it that way through 2 Super Bowls. So on Tuesday evening she said, "What are you taking?" And he said, "I'll do it in the morning." And she said, "What are you taking?" And I was in the room, and I watched a 36-year-old man look at his wife and understand that this was not a conversation he was going to win. And she got a piece of paper. They did it at the kitchen table on Tuesday night, and it took about 25 minutes. She wrote a list. He argued with about 4 things on it. She removed 1 thing and refused to remove the other 3, and he lost all 3. And then she packed 2 bags while he did something else in another room, and the 2 bags she packed were the ones with the things he actually needs in them. I said to her afterward, "He could have done that." And Taylor Swift said, "He could not have done that." She said, "Donna, that man is going to arrive at a house in Kansas City tonight, and he is going to be on a field at 7 in the morning, and he is going to be there for 17 weeks." She said, "And if the wrong things are in those bags, he will not notice for 4 days, and then he will notice at a bad moment, and he will not tell anybody." I said, "How do you know he wouldn't tell anybody?" And she said, "Has he ever told anybody anything?" And then she said the thing that made me understand what the packing actually was. She said, "I have been doing this for 20 years. She said, "I have moved myself around the world for 20 years, and I have got extremely good at one very specific and completely unglamorous skill, which is knowing what a person will need in 11 days that they are not thinking about today." She said, "It is genuinely the only practical thing I am better at than almost anybody." And she said, "He cannot ask me for anything." She said, "You know that. Everybody in this family knows that. That man would sooner get on a plane with the wrong bag than say, 'Can you do this for me?'" She said, "So I did not ask him if he wanted help." She said, "I asked him what he was taking, and then I got a piece of paper, and then it was happening." I sat in that kitchen and thought about a woman who has been told her whole life that she is extraordinary at one thing, standing at a table on a Tuesday night, being quietly extremely good at something nobody has ever given her any credit for. Part 6 3/4. The thing in the third bag. There is one more thing about the packing, and she did not tell me, and I found out from him yesterday on the telephone. She put something in one of the bags that was not on the list. He found it at about 9 last night, in Kansas City, unpacking. He said, "Mom, she put something in the bag." And I said, "What?" And he said, "I'm not telling you." I said, "Travis." And he said, "No, this one's mine." And I said, "Is it good?" And there was a pause on that telephone. And my son said, "I sat on the end of a bed for about 10 minutes. I said, "That long?" And Travis Kelce said, "It's a very small thing, Mom. It's about the size of a postcard." He said, "And I sat on the end of a bed in an empty house for 10 minutes. I have not asked again, and I am not going to. But I asked her one thing this morning, one question, and I said she did not have to answer it. I said, 'Did you tell him it was in there?' And Taylor Swift said, 'No.' I said, 'So he just found it.' And she said, 'That's the whole point of putting something in a bag.' Part 7. The word he finally said. Now I have to tell you about a different word, because it is the other half of this, and it happened in July, and I have never talked about it. The word is wife. He did not say it for weeks. I want to be precise. They were married on the 3rd of July, and for something like 3 weeks after that, my son did not use the word wife out loud in front of me once. He said Taylor. He said she. He said, on about 4 occasions, the phrase, "We're married," which is a different thing entirely. He did not say my wife. I noticed at about the 18th of July, and I did not say anything, because I did not know what it meant, and because there are things you do not ask a man. And then on the 29th of July he said it, on the telephone, and I heard exactly what it cost him. He was telling me about something logistical, a schedule thing. It does not matter. And he said, "Because my wife's got a thing that week." And then he stopped. There was a gap of about 2 seconds. Not a long one, but he stopped, in the middle of a sentence about a calendar, having said a word. And then he kept going and finished the sentence, and I did not say anything, and the conversation continued for another 10 minutes. And at the end of it, right before he hung up, he said, "Mom." And I said, "Yes." And Travis Kelce said, "I said wife." And I said, "I know." And he said, "That's the first time I've said it to anybody." I said, "What did it feel like?" And there was a pause. And my son said, like I'd got away with something. Part 8. Why it took him 3 weeks. I asked him about it much later, in August, on a different call, about a different thing. I said, "Why did it take you 3 weeks to say wife?" And he said, "Because it's a claim." I said, "What do you mean, a claim?" And Travis said, "Girlfriend isn't a claim. Fiancé isn't really a claim either. It's a plan." He said, "Wife is a claim. You're saying, that person is attached to me." He said, "And I have spent 3 years being extremely careful not to do that." I said, "Careful how?" And my son said, "Mom, do you know what happens the second I say anything about her?" He said, "I have said about 9 sentences about that woman in public in 3 years, and every one of them has been a story for 4 days." He said, "So I stopped saying anything. About the third month." He said, "And then you get married, and there's a word you're supposed to use, and it is a word that puts your name on somebody." He said, "And she's got her own name, and it is on more things than almost anybody's." He said, "So I couldn't do it for 3 weeks." And I said, "What changed?" And Travis Kelce said, "She said it first." Part 9. What she does with it. Which brings me to the thing I have watched her do about 9 times and never mentioned to anybody. Taylor says husband constantly. I want to be specific because this is the whole point. She does not say it in public. That is not what I mean. She has said virtually nothing in public since the 3rd of July, and I have talked about that elsewhere. She says it in rooms. She says it in a kitchen to me about a man who is standing 4 feet away. She will say, "My husband thinks," while he is in the room, looking at her, and he will look up every single time. I have watched him look up 9 times. He does it the way you do when somebody says your name in a shop, a small, involuntary head movement. And then he goes back to what he was doing, and she keeps talking, and neither of them acknowledges it. I asked her about it yesterday morning, after he left, in the kitchen with the coffee. I said, "You do that on purpose." And she said, "Do what?" And I said, "You say husband when he can hear you." And there was a silence. And then Taylor Swift said, "Yes." I said, "Why?" And she said, "Because he took 3 weeks to say wife." She said, "I knew. Obviously I knew. He is not a subtle man, and he did not say it for 3 weeks. And I noticed on about day 4, she said, and I knew exactly why, because I have spent 20 years watching people be careful about saying my name in relation to themselves. She said, "Everybody is careful with me. Everybody has always been careful. It is the single most consistent feature of my entire adult life." She said, "People who love me are careful. My friends are careful. My own family were careful for years and had to be told to stop." And then she said, "So I decided to just say it constantly until he stopped being careful." She said, "I said husband about 40 times in 3 weeks. In rooms. Where he could hear me." She said, "Not at him. Never at him." That would have made it a thing, and then he would have had to have a conversation about it. She said, "I just said it near him until it was normal." I said, "And it worked." And Taylor Swift said, "He said wife on the 29th of July." I said, "You know the date?" And my daughter-in-law said, "Donna, of course I know the date." Part 10. The thing that got me. And then she said one more thing about it, and it is the reason I have made this video today, instead of on Saturday. She said, "Do you want to know the actual reason I did it?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Because I have got about 9 people in my life who will say my name in a sentence about themselves." She said, "Not the ones who know me. There are more than 9 of those." She said, "I mean people who will say, 'My friend Taylor' out loud to somebody else without checking their face first." She said, 9, maybe 11 on a good day. She said, "Everybody else says Taylor, and then does a small thing with their voice. Or they say, 'A friend of mine,' which is the polite version, and which I noticed about 15 years ago and have never been able to stop noticing. And she said, I have got a husband now, she said, and there was a 3-week period where I was going to be somebody's wife, and he could not say it out loud, and I thought, no. She said, not this one. This one is going to be able to say it in a shop. Part 11. What I did not say. There is a thing I did not say to her in that kitchen, and I am going to say it here, because she listens to these, and I have thought about it for a day. I did the same thing to her. For about the first year I said Travis's girlfriend. I did not say her name. I said Travis's girlfriend to people in Cleveland, and Travis's girlfriend to a woman at a thing in 2024, and I told myself it was discretion. It was not discretion. Discretion would have been saying nothing. I was doing the small thing with my voice. I started saying her name at some point in 2024, and I could not tell you when, and I have said my daughter-in-law approximately 400 times on the internet this summer without ever once thinking about what it took me to get there. Taylor. I was careful too. For about a year, I am sorry about it, and I did not know I was doing it, and I know exactly why you counted to 9. Part 11 and a half. I asked Kylie about the word. I called her yesterday afternoon because I wanted to know whether it was just us. I said, how long did it take Jason to say wife? And Kelce said, about 4 seconds. I said, 4 seconds? And she said, Donna, that man said, my wife at the reception, at our own wedding, to a waiter. I said, so it's not a Kelce thing. And Kylie said, no, it's a Travis thing. And then she stopped. I said, or what? And Kelce said, or it's a her thing. She said, think about it. Jason married me. Nobody had ever heard of me. He could say my wife to a waiter in 2018, and the waiter said, congratulations, and brought him a drink. She said, what happens when your brother-in-law says my wife to a waiter? I did not have an answer, and she said, it becomes a thing the waiter tells somebody, and then it is somewhere, and then it is a headline about how he referred to her. She said, I have watched about 9 sentences that man has said in 3 years become 4-day stories. And then she said, so he stopped saying sentences. She said, and everybody thinks that is discretion, and it is not. It is a man who has been trained over 3 years that talking about his own life is a cost. I sat with that for a moment, and then I said, she said the same thing. And Kylie said, obviously she said the same thing. She's been living it since she was 17. Then she said, and Donna, I did it too. I said, did what? And Kelce said, I did the thing with the voice. She said, for about 8 months in 2024 I said Travis's girlfriend to people, in Philadelphia, to women I have known for years. She said, and I told myself it was because I did not want to be the person dropping the name. Then she said, which is exactly what everybody who does it tells themselves. I said, when did you stop? And she said, November 2024. I said, what happened in November 2024? And Kelce said, she cooked me dinner and I could not eat any of it, and my brother-in-law called me at 1:45. She said, after that I could not do the voice anymore. It became ridiculous. Part 11 and 3/4. I asked Jason. I called him after and asked him the same thing, and he did not understand the question at first. I said, do you say Taylor's name out loud to people? And Jason Kelce said, what? I said, to people who do not know her, in a normal conversation, do you say her name? And there was a pause. And my eldest son said, I say my brother's wife. I said, that's the polite version. And he said, is it? And I said, yes, Jason. That is exactly the polite version. And there was a long silence. And then he said, "Huh." He said, "I have never once thought about that." He said, "I say my brother's wife, and I have been saying it since about July, and I thought I was being, I don't know what I thought I was being." I said, "Careful." And Jason Kelce said, "Yeah." And then he said, "I'm going to stop doing that." And I said, "It's not a big thing." And my eldest son said, "Mom, she counted to 9. He said, "You told me she has got 9 people who will say her name in a sentence about themselves." He said, "I'm her brother-in-law, and I am not one of them, and I found that out from a phone call with my mother." He rang me back this morning at about 8. He said, "I did it." And I said, "Did what?" And Jason said, "I was at a thing and somebody asked, and I said, 'Taylor.' And I said, 'How was it?' And Jason Kelce said, 'Nothing happened.' He said, 'Absolutely nothing happened, Mom.' The man said, 'Oh, nice.' And we talked about something else. He said, 3 years. He said, 3 years I have been doing a small thing with my voice, and I did not know I was doing it, and it turns out nothing happens." Part 11 and 7/8. The first time she said it. I want to give you one specific occasion because I have said she says husband in rooms about 9 times, and I want to give you the first one, which was the 11th of July, 8 days after the wedding. It was a kitchen. There were about 6 people in it, ordinary evening, and she was in the middle of a sentence to somebody who is not in this family, and she said, "My husband thinks that's ridiculous." And he looked up. That was the first one. I was standing about 4 feet away, with a glass in my hand, and I watched a 36-year-old man look up, like somebody had said his name in a shop, and then look back down. And nobody said anything, and the conversation carried on. I did not think about it at the time. I thought it was sweet, and I moved on. I thought about it 18 days later, on the 29th of July, when he said wife on the telephone, and then stopped in the middle of a sentence about a calendar. And I have thought about the 11th of July approximately once a week since. Because she said it 8 days after the wedding, and he did not manage it for 26. And she noticed on about day 4. And she did not say one word to him about it for the entire 3 weeks. She simply started saying husband in rooms until it was ordinary furniture, and then he could. I asked her yesterday how many times she thinks she said it in those 3 weeks. And Taylor Swift said, "About 40. And I said, "You counted?" And she said, "No. I did it deliberately, which is different from counting." And then she said, "And I want to be honest, that about 10 of them were harder than they looked." I said, "Harder how?" And she said, "Because you can hear yourself." She said, "You say my husband in a room, and part of you is standing outside the room, listening to a 36-year-old woman say a word she is not used to." She said, "And there is a version of that where it sounds like you are trying it on." She said, "I said it about 40 times in 3 weeks, and about 10 of them I heard myself and thought, 'Who do you think you are?'" I said, "And you kept going." And Taylor Swift said, "Obviously I kept going." She said, "He needed to hear it 40 times so that on the 29th of July he could say it once." Part 12. The 11 days. He will be back in 11 days. Not for long. There is a game, and then there is another game, and the season is 17 weeks, and then whatever happens after that happens. She said 11 days, and she said it precisely, which I noticed. I said, "How do you know it's 11? And Taylor Swift said, "Because I have it written down." I said, "Where?" And she said, "On a piece of paper on a fridge, like a person." I went and looked. I want to be honest that I went and looked about 20 minutes later when she was on the telephone in another room, which is a thing I am not proud of. There is a piece of paper on the fridge. It is not romantic. I want to be clear about that because I was expecting something, and it is not that. It is a list of dates in her handwriting, about 14 of them, from now until the end of December. Each one is a day where they are going to be in the same place. Some of them have a question mark next to them. 4 of them do not. And at the bottom, in the same handwriting, underlined once, it says, Not a schedule. Part 13. I asked her about it. I could not ask. I lasted about an hour. I said, I looked at your fridge. And she said, I know you did. And I said, How do you know? And Taylor Swift said, Because I heard you stop walking. I said, What does not a schedule mean? And she said, It means we made a rule in July, and I have to keep writing it down, or I'll break it. I said, What's the rule? And she said, The rule is that every one of those dates has to be chosen. She said, I could put us in the same place 40 times between now and Christmas. It would not even be difficult. His season is fixed, and mine is not, and I could simply organize myself around his calendar for 4 months and be there constantly. She said, and it would be lovely, and I would see my husband a great deal more. And she said, and after about 6 weeks he would stop noticing. She said, because that is what happens. That is the thing everybody who has been married for 30 years knows, and nobody says to anybody who has been married for 8 weeks. She said, presence becomes furniture. She said, so we made a rule. Every single one of those dates, one of us moves something real to make it happen. It has to cost something. If it does not cost anything, it does not go on the list. She said, that is why there are 14 and not 40. And then she said, and that is what the piece of paper is. It is a list of the times we chose each other, in advance, so that we do not accidentally become people who just live somewhere. Part 14. What Ed said. I told him last night on the telephone. All of it. The fridge, the 14 dates, the underlining, and my husband did not say anything for about 8 seconds. And then Ed Kelce said, that's the smartest thing anybody in this family has ever done. I said, it's a piece of paper on a fridge. And he said, I know what it is. And then he said something I did not expect at all. He said, we should have done that. I said, Ed. And he said, no, I mean it. We should have done that in about 1991. He said, we had it. In 1985, 1986, we had it. Everything cost something, and everything was chosen because we had nothing and no time. He said, and then it got easier, and we had a house and a routine, and there was a default, and the default ate about 14 years. I said, 14? And my husband said, 1991 to about 2005. He said, they were good years. The boys were the best thing that has ever happened to either of us, and I would not change a day of it. Then he said, but you and I did not choose each other once between about 1991 and 2005. We just lived in the same house and did the job. I did not say anything for a moment, and then I said, when did it come back? And Ed Kelce said, 2006. Jason went to college. He said, and it was extremely uncomfortable for about 2 years because we had to work out who we were, and I have told you that I did not know what I was for, and you have told the internet that you did not either. Then he said, and then it came back, and the last 20 years have been the best of my life. He said, but it went for 14 years and nobody warned us and there was no piece of paper on a fridge. Part 14 and a half, the 14 days. I want to give you the 14, because I looked at that piece of fridge paper for about 90 seconds, and I have a reasonable memory, and I have thought about it since. I am not going to give you dates, and I am not going to give you places, and I would not do that. But I want to tell you what kind of days they are, because it is not what I expected. There is not one romantic occasion on that list. I want to say that again, because I stood in a kitchen and could not work it out for about a minute. No anniversary, no birthday, There is nothing on it that anybody would put on a list of significant days. There are 4 dates with no question mark, and I looked hardest at those. One of them is a Tuesday. I asked her about it this morning. I said, "Why is there a Tuesday?" And Taylor Swift said, "Because Tuesdays are the worst ones." She said, "Sundays he plays. Mondays he's wrecked and he sleeps. Wednesday and Thursday are the working middle of a week, and Friday there is a travel day." She said, "Tuesday is the day where nothing is happening, and he is on his own in a house, and it is week 11 of 17. She said, "Nobody flies anywhere on a Tuesday in November for no reason." She said, "That is why it is on the list." And then she said the thing that made me sit down for the second time in 2 days. She said, "The good days do not need help." She said, "We will be fine at Christmas. Everybody is fine at Christmas. There will be a house full of people and 4 children, and it will be lovely, and neither of us will have to do anything for it." She said, "I did not put Christmas on the list." She said, "I put a Tuesday in November on the list, because that is the day where a man who might be finishing his career is going to be sitting on his own in Kansas City with nothing on, and nobody in the world is going to think to do anything about it." I said, "Does he know that's why it's there?" And she said, "No." And I said, "Are you going to tell him?" And Taylor Swift said, "He'll work it out in November." She said, "He is not slow. He will look at a calendar in about week 11 and go, 'Hang on, why is she coming on a Tuesday?' And then she said, and then he will know that somebody looked at 17 weeks in August and picked the worst day." Part 14 and 3/4. What I got wrong about the article. I want to correct myself, because I have spent this entire video treating a paragraph on a website as though somebody did something careless. I read it again this morning, 4th time, and I do not think it is careless. Here is the sentence in full. It says, "They spent so much time together in the months leading up to the wedding, and they were pretty much inseparable. Now they're settling into this new rhythm as a married couple and really enjoying what that feels like." Read it again. Somebody who knows those two people said that to a journalist on purpose. That is not a stranger's summary. That is a person who was in the building saying, very precisely, there was a period, it was extraordinary, it has ended, and what is happening now is different, and they are all right. And they put it in the past tense, because it is in the past tense. I said this to her this morning on the telephone. I said, "I think whoever said that to page 6 knew exactly what they were doing." And there was a pause, and Taylor Swift said, "Yes." I said, "Do you know who it was?" And she said, "Donna." And I said, "All right." And then she said one thing about it, and it is the last piece of this. She said, "Whoever it was got it right," which almost never happens. She said, "Usually those things are wrong in a way that does not matter, and you let it go. 90% of everything ever written about me is wrong in a way that does not matter." She said, "That one is correct, and it is more correct than the person writing it probably realized, and it took my mother-in-law about 14 hours to notice." And then she said, "And I would like it on the record that I noticed in about 4 minutes." Part 15. For the people listening. This is the part that is for you, and it is the whole reason I have made this today. Somebody wrote a nice article about my son and his wife yesterday, and put the word inseparable in the past tense without noticing. And 3 of us noticed, and none of us had said it to each other, and one of us was standing in a doorway at 6:30 yesterday morning, watching a car reverse out. Here is what I have worked out in about 30 hours. Marriage takes away the choosing. That is the trade. That is the actual trade, and nobody explains it to anybody. You spend a period of your life, a year, 3 years, 11 months, whatever you got, where every single time you are in the same room as that person, it is because somebody moved something to make it happen. And then you get married, or you move in, or you have a child, and the arrangement becomes the arrangement. And it is better. I want to be extremely clear that it is better, And I have had 46 years of the better version, and I would not swap 1 week of it. But nobody chooses you anymore. They just have you. And here is the thing that I want the women my age to actually hear. Because I have got about 400,000 of you, and I know approximately what your Thursday looks like. You can put it back. I do not mean romance. I am not telling anybody to book a hotel. I mean the specific mechanism, which is that it has to cost something. There is a piece of paper on a fridge somewhere in this country with 14 dates on it and the words, "Not a schedule," underlined once at the bottom, written by a 36-year-old woman who worked out at 8 weeks married, what took my husband and me about 30 years to notice and 14 years to lose. 4 things have to be true for it to work. She did not list them, and I have worked them out, and I am giving them to you. 1. It has to be a specific day, written down in advance. 2. One of you has to move something real for it. Not, "We're both free." Free is not chosen. Something has to be shifted. 3. It has to be small enough to actually happen. 14, not 40. 4. You have to say out loud that it is what it is. That is what the underlining is for. That is it. That is the entire method, and it was invented by somebody who has been married for 8 weeks, and it should have been invented by somebody like me about 40 years ago. I want to say one more thing about it, and then I am finished, and it is about who this is actually for. If you are 70 and your husband is in the next room, you are the person I am talking to. Not the young ones. The young ones are fine. The young ones have got jobs and distance and 150 things that get in the way, which sounds like a problem and is actually the engine. You have got nothing in the way. That is the trap, and nobody says it out loud. You are both retired, or nearly. You are in the same house all day. There is no distance, no schedule, no obstacle, nothing to move. And so nothing gets chosen, because there is nothing left to choose against. Ed and I have been in the same building for approximately 22 hours a day for 4 years, and I am telling you plainly that we chose each other more often in 1985 when we could not afford a telephone. So find something to move. It does not matter what. It is genuinely ridiculous. I have written down a day in October when I am going to miss a thing I do every week, which I have done every week for 11 years, and it is not important, and nobody will notice, and Ed does not know which thing it is. That is the entire point. Something has to be given up, or it does not count. That is not romance. That is arithmetic. Part 15 and a half. What I did this morning. I want to tell you what I did at about 7 o'clock this morning, because I would like somebody to do it with me. I got a piece of paper. I am not going to pretend it was dramatic. I was in my own kitchen in Cleveland, with the light over the stove on, and my husband was upstairs, and I got a piece of paper out of a drawer. And I wrote 4 dates on it. 4. Between now and Christmas. Not 14. I am 73 years old, and Ed and I are in the same house every single day, and there is nothing to arrange. That is the problem. That is precisely the problem. So I wrote 4 days on a piece of paper, and each one of them is a day where I am going to move something. Not a holiday, not a birthday. His is in December, and it does not count, because birthdays do not count, because nobody has to choose a birthday. 4 ordinary days on which I am going to do something that costs me a thing I would rather not give up. I put it on the fridge. He came down at about 8 and he read it, and he did not say anything for a while. And then Ed Kelce said, "What's this?" And I said, "It's 4 days." And he said, "For what?" And I said, "For choosing you." I want to tell you exactly what my husband did, because I have been married to him since 1980, and I did not expect it. He read it again, and then he took the pen out of the pot on the counter, and he wrote something at the bottom of it, and put the pen back, and went and did something in another room. He had written 2 more dates. In his handwriting, which is terrible, and which is where Jason gets it from. 2 dates, under my 4, both of which are in October, neither of which is anything, and underneath them he had written 3 words. He had written, "Not a schedule." He had heard me say it on the telephone last night, to him, describing a piece of paper on a fridge 400 miles away that a 36-year-old woman wrote in August. And he came downstairs this morning and put 2 dates on our fridge and copied her underlining. I have been married to that man for 46 years, and he has said 4 sentimental sentences a decade since 1953, and this morning he wrote 3 words on a piece of paper and went into another room. Part 15 3/4. What the woman with the notebook said. She was there on Tuesday night, and I got about 6 minutes with her on Wednesday morning while everything was happening, and I want to give it to you because she has been in that woman's life since 2008, and nobody ever asks her anything. I said, "You were at that table on Tuesday." And she said, "I was." And I said, "Had you ever done that before?" And she said, "Not once." She said, "I have organized that woman's life for 18 years. I have moved her through 9 countries in 11 days. I have built calendars that other people study." She said, "I have never once built one that had somebody else in it." I said, "Never?" And she said, "Donna, there has never been anybody else in it." She said, "There have been people, obviously there have been people, but the calendar was hers, and things got moved around it." She said, "On Tuesday night there were 2. I said, "How did that feel?" And this woman, who keeps notebooks going back to 2008, who has been described in this family as the person who has actually run everything, did not answer for about 4 seconds. And then she said, "I have been waiting 18 years for a second calendar." And then she said something that I have written down. She said, "I have watched that woman be extraordinary at her job for 18 years, and I have watched her be alone in the scheduling for all of them." She said, "Everything has always been arranged around her," which sounds like the best possible arrangement and is actually the loneliest one. She said, "On Tuesday night, there was somebody else's Thursday on the table, and it mattered as much as hers." I said, "Did she notice?" And the woman with the notebook said, "She noticed at about 9:10 when you asked whether they had ever done it before. She said, 'I watched her face.'" Part 15 7/8. What Andrea said. I called her this morning because she is the only other person in this arrangement who has done what I have done, which is give a child to somebody. I said, "Andrea, when Scott moved out for work, how did you do it?" And Andrea Swift said, "He never did." I said, "Never?" And she said, 30-something years in finance, and that man came home every night." She said, "That is the entire story of my marriage, and I did not know it was unusual until my daughter got engaged to somebody who leaves for 5 months a year." I said, "So what do you tell her?" And there was a pause. And Andrea Swift said, "Nothing." She said, "I have got nothing for her, Donna." She said, "I have got 40 years of a man who came home, and I have never once had to work out what to do when he does not, and my daughter has married somebody who will not be in the same state until January." She said, "I am completely useless on this one." I said, "That's not true." And she said, "It is entirely true, and I have made my peace with it." Then she said, "You're the one who knows." I said, "I'm what?" And Andrea Swift said, "Donna, your husband coached, your sons played. You have spent your entire adult life with men who leave in August." She said, "I have spent mine with one who was in the kitchen at 6. She said, "So when she rings somebody in November, it is not going to be me." I did not say anything for a moment. And then I said, "Does that bother you?" And Taylor Swift's mother said, "It did for about a week in July." She said, and then I thought about it properly. She said, "That girl has had me for 36 years, and she is going to have me for however many more. And there is one specific category of thing that I cannot help her with, and there happens to be a 73-year-old woman in Ohio who has done exactly that for 40 years." She said, "And my daughter married into it." And then she said, "It is the single luckiest thing about this entire arrangement, and nobody has ever mentioned it." Part 16. He rang her last night. I know because I was still there, and I heard the beginning of it, and then I went upstairs like a decent person. She told me this morning what he said, and I asked if I could use it, and she thought about it for a moment and said yes, and then said, "He'll be embarrassed." And I said, "He's always embarrassed." And Taylor Swift said, "Fair." She said he called at about 10. First night in Kansas City. First night of a season, in a house, on his own, 400 miles away. And he said, "I read the thing." And she said, "Which thing?" And he said, "The new normal thing." And she said, "I know, I read it too." And there was a pause. And Travis Kelce said, "It says, were." She said she did not say anything for a second, and then she said, "I know it does." And he said, "I noticed last night, and I didn't say anything because I was leaving at 5:30. And she said, "I noticed yesterday afternoon, and I didn't say anything because you were leaving at 5:30. And she said they both laughed, on the telephone, 400 miles apart, at 10 o'clock at night on the first night of a season. And then she said, he said one more thing, and it is the last thing in this video. He said, "Put me on the fridge." I'm Donna Kelce, Taylor Swift's mother-in-law. Yesterday morning my son moved out for the season, and his wife packed 2 of his bags and stood in a doorway and lifted a hand. Somebody wrote yesterday that they used to be inseparable and did not notice they had put it in the past tense, and 3 of us noticed, and none of us had told each other. There is a piece of paper on a fridge with 14 days on it, and 4 of them have no question mark, and at the bottom in her handwriting it says, "Not a schedule," underlined once. Nobody has to choose him anymore. She is going to anyway, 14 times before Christmas, in writing, and one of them is a Tuesday in November for no reason at all, because she looked at 17 weeks in August and picked the worst day in it. There is a second piece of paper now. It is on a fridge in Cleveland, Ohio, and it has 4 days on it in my handwriting and 2 more underneath in my husband's, which is terrible, and which is where Jason gets it from. He wrote his at about 8 o'clock this morning, and then went into another room without saying anything. He copied her underlining. And there is something the size of a postcard in a house in Kansas City that a man found in a bag at 9 o'clock last night and sat on the end of a bed with for 10 minutes, and he will not tell me what it is, and I have decided I am not going to ask again. 16 days until Denver. Thank you for sitting with me today.